رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope that it's not too early on Friday morning for a discussion of Khums. We have a task before us, which is to gain some insight into the obligation in Islam that all of us are familiar with, which is a financial obligation, a monetary obligation towards Allah, towards our Prophet, towards our religion. Now, within the space of about 20 to 25 minutes, it's obviously not going to be possible for us to have a comprehensive understanding of how to calculate and how to pay our khums. Nor would it have been possible for us to answer all of the objections that people have in their mind about either the legislation and the history of khums, or the practical application and implementation of khums in our time. That's not going to be possible. But what I want to do in the time that we have allotted is to combine both elements of that discussion, to give a little bit of a religious and a historical perspective about what khums is and where it comes from, and then to give a little bit of a general overview and a few relevant cases about the calculation of khums. Please bear in mind that I am not going to be crossing all T's and dotting all I's. This is not meant to be a session where if we're discussing a case, you can say that, well, this case applies to me, and therefore my khums is exactly this amount. That simply is not possible in this limited time. But what it is meant to do, it is meant to tell you that if you have a case like this, these are the general rules that will govern the amount or the nature of your khums liability, if any. And part of that calculation will also be made easier for you. But there might be other considerations that you will also need to look at. The cliff notes do not substitute for reading the actual literature. And that applies to our case as well. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So I want to begin with a little bit of the question of the importance of khums as an institution. Khums is mentioned directly once in the Quran, in Surah Al-Anfal, verse 41. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّمَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَأَنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِلرَّسُولِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى, and so on. That verse gives us the requirement to pay khums on مَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ, that which you have acquired. And the context of the surah in that section pertains to the battle of Badr. It pertains to the spoils of war. Now, many Muslims have said that therefore this verse of khums, it applies to the spoils of war. There is a question that comes into the minds of many people, that why would Quran mention khums once in this verse and mention zakat so frequently and pair zakat with salat if in our legal framework, as followers of Ahlul Bayt, probably as I look across this room, none of you has zakat, aside from zakatul fitrah, that applies to your earnings. Maybe some of you. But most all of you will have a khums liability that will devolve on your shoulders. And so it might seem to be a little bit of a disconnect. Now, to begin to answer that question, and again, keeping our time constraint in mind, first of all Muslims agree, even those who do not believe in khums as it is practiced and taught within the school of Ahlul Bayt, all Muslims agree that khums is not limited to spoils of war, that it does apply to other forms of income, whether it be a treasure that you might discover, if you're lucky, whether it be mining, whether it be other forms of income. That is not directly mentioned in the context of this Quranic verse, but it's relevant to a principle that we have within the Quran, which is that sometimes verses of the Quran were revealed not in order for them to be limited by the historical context in which they were revealed, but in order to open up a door, to open up a chapter that will be developed and that will be contextualized in one of two methods: by further verses and by the ahadith and the sayings and the teachings and the practice of the Prophet and the Imams. That is not outside of the Quran, but it is part of the Quranic logic. What is the level of extension that is going to take place? Well, naturally, in the battle of Badr, the relevant extension is going to be the spoils of war, or in another battle it would be the income that is derived from that battle. But the law that is legislated at that time is legislated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's legislated by the creator of the heavens and the earth. And in this verse, we have an indication that the legislation should not be limited to warfare. And this is the example that we have of what that khums is to be used for God, meaning for purposes that serve religion. Allah is not going to do anything with the khums that was taken from the spoils of war, but it would be used by the Prophet to fulfill certain needs of the religious community. And so what the Quran is telling us is that this is now a source for the fulfillment of certain religious needs that the Muslim community has. And Allah in His wisdom would know that the Muslim world is not intended to always be in a state of warfare. Allah did not intend to send His Prophet to engage in battles and acquire spoils of war and then use the spoils of war to meet those vital Islamic requirements. There is a misconception that many non-Muslims have, and unfortunately that some Muslims have, that Islam was a warlike religion. But you can see from this verse of Khums, as it was explained and as it was interpreted by Ahlul Bayt, is that warfare, those spoils of battle, that was, in a sense, just the excuse that Allah used to introduce a certain financial framework for the Muslim world, which was to operate with equal effectiveness in peacetime as it was in times of war. This verse of Khums, if it is understood to be referring to spoils of war, then it really doesn't have much universal import. It doesn't really have any message to meet those needs that are met by the Khums, when Muslims are not in a state of battle. And the understanding of this verse that we have from Ahlul Bayt, that is a universalization of that temporal and historical circumstance. According to our belief, that universalization was foreseen and was intended by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from that early moment when He was referring to spoils of war. So now that brings me to the next point that I want to make sure that we have some thought towards. Khums is intended to meet certain needs of the Muslim community as a community and not as a collection of individuals. There are ahadith that distinguish khums from zakat as we know of the two in fiqh. Even though in a general sense, khums being part of our religious obligations is a form of purification and a form of sadaqah in a literal or in a linguistic sense. But the legal institution of zakat is intended to meet certain needs. The legal institution of khums is meant to meet other needs. One of the points that has been emphasized in many ahadith is that khums is the property of the imam to be utilized in such a way that it can preserve the cohesive existence of the Muslim community and ummah through time, to preserve that dynamic and not just to meet certain material needs. Sometimes people will make that objection that should I give khums in order to support an academic institution or to support scholarship or the other uses that khums is put to, when there are people who are starving, when there are people who have been struck by various forms of disasters and they have very immediate needs. It's not a perfect example, but just to give a little bit of a common example that people are familiar with in their own daily life. When people are in that immediate material need, there is an obligation that we as individuals and that we as a society have to meet that need for food, to meet that need for shelter, those immediate and very basic fundamental needs. At the same time, does that mean that as a society we should empty our museums of artistic and historical artifacts in order to get the cash and then to spend it to meet those needs? In some cases, perhaps we shouldn't be extravagant in collecting that art and those artifacts at that kind of a time. But on some level, we all will appreciate the fact that to preserve that heritage, to preserve that identity, to preserve that institution, is what is going to allow that nation, that group, that religious people to have a continued existence and to continue to derive inspiration and insight and motivation to engage in individual acts of charity. There does come a point where we need to spend on the collective identity, the preservation of scholarship, the preservation of identity in a way that will allow those individual acts of charity to continue to exist and to continue to be derived from a sense of religious and moral and spiritual obligation. And that is found in a similar way in a hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. When the second caliph came to Mecca during the period of his caliphate, and he saw in the Kaaba certain artifacts which were valuable. The artifacts which may have been preserved from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail, if those narrations are accurate. In any case, they were, in some cases, composed of precious metals, and they had an intrinsic value. And the Caliph said that I'll sell this and I'll use it for the good of the Muslim Ummah. And Amir al-Mu'mineen said, don't do that, because these existed when the Prophet was there, and the Prophet said that to preserve this is more important than just to take the cash value. So now, does that mean that Khums is being utilized perfectly? Does that mean that there is absolutely nothing that could be improved? That's not my point. My point is that we should be thinking, even when we are critiquing or questioning or trying to imagine how to optimize, we should be thinking in these terms. That this is something that is meant to preserve our collective identity, our existence as a religious community. And therefore, the utilization of the Khums and the importance of the Khums is not something that is purely charity. So for example, if there is a worthy cause, this is a widespread malady within the Shi'i community, and I hope that all of you will carry this message to others who are not present. When there is a worthy cause that is going to be introduced in the Shi'i community, the first question that many people will ask when they are approached is, do you have an ijazah for Khums? If it's a worthy cause, then give to that worthy cause to the extent that you are able, regardless of whether it has an ijazah for Khums or not. Khums is not meant to be how you decide where to give your charitable giving. Khums is meant to be spent to meet certain needs of the religion. My point here is not who makes that decision now and how they are making it and whether they're making it effectively or not. My point is to say that if I want to contribute to a school, if I want to contribute to a charitable or a humanitarian cause, then I shouldn't say that, well, if they have an ijazah for Khums, then it's worthy. If they don't have an ijazah for Khums, then the marja must have seen something unworthy and therefore I shouldn't give. Or I'm not going to be able to meet my Khums obligation and therefore I lose my motivation. That is one logic, that is one obligation that we have. That should not bear any kind of relationship to our charitable giving. And in fact, whatever Khums we give, regardless of our taqleed, regardless of who we give it to and how we give it, that should not even enter into my mind as something that I have given. That was a debt that I owed to Allah. I have paid my debt. If somebody accepts my Khums from me, then I should kiss their hand and say that thank you for assisting me in paying off my debt. The same way that I will thank a person who helps me to perform Hajj. I will thank a person who helps me to perform Salat. I won't say that the teacher that taught me how to pay Zakat, I'm doing them a favor. Choose a teacher for Salat. Choose a caravan leader for Hajj. Choose a person that you are going to give your Khums to who is worthy of that honor. But once you have selected, then consider it the payment of a debt. And the Imams emphasize this as an institution, that we accept your Khums so that you are purified. Don't think that you are doing us a favor. When we pay our Khums, we're not paying our Khums to a marja. We're not paying a Khums certainly to a wakil. We are paying our Khums trying to fulfill our obligation towards our religion. We are paying it to the Imam, and we are responsible to the Imam. And we're not doing a favor to Islam or to Allah or to our Imam. Now, I don't want to spend much more time on that. How much time do I have now for some practical applications and case studies? About 15 minutes? 10 minutes? Is that correct? Inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So again, we're not going to go comprehensively, but we're going to be speaking in terms of some important case studies that will help us understand how to calculate our Khums. One of the areas that is subject to Khums is our earnings after we deduct our expenses. So, just to take a very simple example, if I earned $50,000 this year, and I had $30,000 of expenses, then my savings are $20,000, and I will pay 1/5 of that, which is $4,000 in Khums. So that is the basis or the fundamental understanding of what Khums is. Now, questions come in as to what counts as an expense and how do we deal with some more complicated situations. Let me first address which types of things are considered to be earnings. Let's say that I have $50,000 that I earned from a consultancy or a business or employment that I have. But then I had $10,000 that I inherited. A woman may have $10,000 that she received in dowry. In most Muslim countries, I think $10,000 is a lot less than the dowry. It's usually specified much higher and then perhaps not paid. But let's say there's $10,000 of the dowry. There is $10,000 from an inheritance. $10,000 that came from a gift from, say, a parent. So, which types of income are subject to Khums? The payment that a woman receives as her mahr, or if there is a khul', which is a type of divorce, the payment that is received in exchange of khul'. That will not be subject to Khums. Right? It's usually a woman receiving mahr. Khul' hopefully is something that is rare, and if there is ever a case, I hope the husband will not demand a payment for it. So the relevant situation is mahr. It is a good thing in Islam to specify a mahr that is doable, and for the husband to actually intend and to pay the mahr when he is able. That mahr, if it is cash, even if it's saved for years, it is not liable for Khums. It's not subject to Khums. Inheritance is not subject to Khums in most circumstances. So if you inherit money from a parent, if you inherit money, God forbid, from a child, God forbid in the sense that hopefully your child will not predecease you, not that they will not leave anything. If you inherit money from another close relative, that money is not subject to Khums, with certain exceptions. However, according to many fuqaha, and this is a matter of dispute, a gift is subject to Khums. So if I am a student and my parents or other relatives, they support me, if they're supporting me by putting their property and giving me access to it, but it's their property and they make the decisions about it, then that's up to them to calculate the Khums. But if they give me, for example, my living expenses, if they're giving me $1,000 a month, or if they give me a gift of $5,000 and it's mine, then that counts as income for me. If I spend it within the year, there's no Khums. It's income for that year. But if I don't spend it and there's savings, then whatever portion is saved will be subject to Khums. So it's income, even though I didn't work for it. Some fuqaha do say that that gift is not liable for Khums. Another thing that is liable for Khums is wasiyah. If I make a will or a wasiyah in favor of a certain person. Now this is an important case study, and it's relevant to any of you who are going to be making a will, and so I want to spend a little bit of time on it just to clarify a point. I'm going to need your attention because it might be easy to lose where I am and what I'm talking about if you look at your watch for a moment or get distracted by a text. Inheritance is not subject to Khums. If I make a wasiyah, it is subject to Khums as income for that year. Now, what happens in Islam is that in some cases, the default system of inheritance does not meet our needs as an individual or the way that our lives operate in our time. For example, in Islam, the majority of the inheritance will not go to a spouse, a husband or a wife. It will go to a child. In some cases, especially if we have minor children, or if we have a spouse, it could be a wife or it could be a husband who is dependent on us, it might be necessary or it might be advisable to give a larger portion of that inheritance, of that estate, to the spouse. Islam does say that if I have sons and daughters, the son will have twice the share of a daughter. I'm not discussing now why that is and how that is, but in some cases, it might be I have a blended family, I have children and stepchildren. It may be because my daughter has a greater share of debt or a greater need. I may need to, or I may wish to give more to one person. So it could be a spouse, it could be a son or a daughter. The situation is clear, right? Many of us have experienced it. The solution that many of us use is that we make a wasiyah. And Islam allows that and encourages a wasiyah. And the Quran says that you give a wasiyah لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Give it to your parents and give it to your near ones. Those are individual circumstances. So fix that situation. But be aware that if my daughter is going to get half of what my son gets, what my son is going to get is inheritance. And he won't pay khums on any of it. What my daughter gets through inheritance, she will not pay inheritance, any khums on. But if I make up for that difference or I give her extra because of my determination through a wasiyah, that wasiyah, I'm thinking of it as equalizing the inheritance. That's what's in my mind, right? My spouse, I'm trying to equalize the inheritance. But Islamically, this is not inheritance. It is a wasiyah. And so be aware that that will be subject to khums if it's not utilized or spent by the end of the person's khums year. So wasiyah is subject to khums, even if we're using that wasiyah as is commonly done and as it's good to do in order to equalize or to make our will meaningful and relevant and beneficial for our families. I won't spend more time on that. Another thing that is often a matter of confusion is that the khums is liable on the basis of the expenses for a year. It's not on the cash. So what many people do for khums is they say that, let's say my khums year runs from January 1st to December 31st. I had $10,000 in my account on January 1st. I had a good year. I have $20,000 in my account on January 1st of next year. For some of us, that's a good year. For some of us, that might be pocket change. Right? And so I will pay khums on that 10,000, I will pay a khums of 2,000. That is not necessarily the case. If I have expenses from this year, even if it was on, for example, credit, and I will be paying it later, I can deduct that expense from my savings because the expense was incurred during this year. So if I, in December, in this example, if I have an expense because I had to purchase, for example, food, I had to do an emergency medical procedure, I'm not going to be paying for it until January or until February. The payment is next year. But when is the expense occurred? Does that belong to this year or does that belong to next year? It belongs to this year. And therefore, if I have an equal amount to that expense, I don't pay khums on it. If that procedure is going to cost me $2,000, and I have $2,000 in savings, I have 0 khums. That $2,000 belongs to this year. Theoretically, it is possible for you to have income today that belongs to future years. So let's say, for example, that you are a worker and you are going to be hiring yourself out for the next 2 years, and the person pays you today. The portion that they're paying you for this year is income for this year. the portion they're paying you for your work next year, even if they've paid you this year, is not income for this year, and there's no khums on it this year, because it's not income from this year. So both on the expense side and on the income side, it's a matter of the year. What that also tells us is, well, actually, let me make one more point. I know that we're running short on time, but just a few other important issues that are relevant, and I will end, inshallah, on time. When do you start your khums year? That's a perennial question that people have. This is something that different maraja do have different fatwa on. I'm giving you the fatwa of Sayyid Sistani, and I would also say the majority of our fuqaha, there are some exceptions. Your khums year, if you do not have earning, is when you have your first income. So if I am a student and I'm still living on my parents' largesse, I'm not earning anything, then the moment I have earning, then that is the beginning of my khums year. If anything remains at the end of that year, then I will be liable for khums. If I am working or I am earning though, my khums year begins from when I am starting to earn, even if I have not been paid. So if you get a job, right, your first job out of college, you change jobs after having had no income, whatever the case may be. Your khums year doesn't start 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now from when you get your first paycheck or when you make your first commission. You've started to earn now, your khums year begins now, and you can deduct expenses even before you actually get your paycheck from your khums year. But the khums is your liability not at the end of the year from when you begin the job. Your khums is your liability from when you earn it. Meaning that I am liable for that khums right from now, even though I haven't yet taken my first paycheck. I don't have to pay it for a year. What that means is that I can always choose to pay it early. I can always say that, well, this is March 31st. I have cash. I'm going to pay my khums liability from January 1st to March 31st. Which means that you can always change your khums year by bringing it forward, by equaling out your accounts. So you can do that. Again, this is a matter of dispute among some fuqaha. But you can do that because your khums is a liability at any moment. Once you have paid that liability, you can then start afresh for the next year. So I can't say that, well, I'd rather have a khums year starting in June, so I'm going to give it 18 months. But what you can do is you can say, I'll pay it after 6 months, and then from there on out, I'll start paying it every year. That is something which is an important issue. Let me just make one more case that I will mention, and then we'll conclude. This is if you have a situation where you have something that you bought that was part of your expenses for the year, and then you don't need it anymore. This frequently happens when people, for example, they have a house, they've lived in that house, and now they want to sell that house, and, for example, buy another house. The way that works is that if you sell a car, a house, something that was part of your ma'una, part of your needs, then if it's after your khums year is ended, meaning you've lived in there past the date of your khums year or used that object past the date of your khums year, then you will only be liable for the additional income that you receive, the profit that you receive, as income for the new year. So if I lived, for example, in my house for 3 years, and I sell it, I will only be liable for khums on the additional income if I don't use it, on the capital gains, if I don't use it by the end of the khums year in which it is sold. It's income in that year. I'm not liable for khums on the whole thing, and I'm not automatically liable for the khums on the profit if I use it either to buy a new house, or in rent, or to pay off debt, or for whatever other reason I might be using it for. And it is permissible, if you're going to be selling your house, and you might not be able to buy another house because your khums year is coming up in, say, 3 weeks, it is acceptable to, again, equal out your khums liability just before that, and that'll give you then 12 months from the date of the sale of the house to utilize that income. So these are workarounds which are not Islamically frowned upon or Islamically problematic. We will have to conclude there because we are out of time. I hope that has been beneficial for you, and of course you will also have to look at detailed rulings for any specific calculation of khums that you may wish to do. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.